Continuing our journey through the 50 arguments offered on the website godisimaginary.com, we've reached number 26. Number 26 is entitled, Notice the Bible's Author is Not All-Knowing. The argument begins with a series of texts from the Old Testament, a number of which we're already familiar with. These are texts that are taken from the law codes of the books of Moses, especially Exodus and Deuteronomy. A number of texts that have to do with various punishments given for certain kinds of crimes. The observation that's made here, which is one that we've seen several times before in different ways, the observation that's made here is that these various texts of Scripture, when you read them, are less than inspiring. And the author argues that these are not the kinds of things that we would expect from a divine being. If God is truly the author of Scripture, why does the Bible include these things in it that are not very inspiring and are not very uplifting and impressive? The Bible then, according to the argument, expresses things that we would not expect of God, and they do express things, though, that we would expect of primitive human beings. The kinds of things and the kinds of laws and so on that we find in the Bible are what we would expect of people in that time period, in that world, not what we would expect of God. In response to this, I would just quickly make several observations, things that we've talked about before, and so I don't think it will take that much time to offer, I think, some reasonable responses to this. First of all, I think it should be noted that that when we look at ancient texts and they bear the characteristics of the ancient world in which they were written, that is what we would expect from a Christian standpoint. We do not believe that the Bible is a kind of transcendent book dropped out of heaven. This actually, the argument that's being made here might be a good observation or argument to be made about the Quran or the claims that Muslim makes about their holy book. And I'll let Muslims provide their own response to that, because as I understand it, in Islam they believe that the Quran is an eternal book in the presence of God that was dictated to the Prophet Muhammad. From a Christian standpoint, though, we do not make those kinds of claims about the Bible. We don't believe that the Bible is a trans-historical book. We believe that it is a book that has been inspired by God in time and space and history, and therefore it bears the characteristics and the marks of the historical time periods in which it was written. In order for us to properly understand it, we must try to put ourselves back in the historical time period in which the biblical books were written. So we would expect it then, from the standpoint of the Christian understanding of Scripture, we would expect it to have these kinds of characteristics of their own time period. At the same time, of course, we do claim that the Bible is more than that. The Bible is more than just a collection of ancient or primitive texts written in their time period. We believe it is inspired by God, and therefore it should direct us to truths that transcend those periods of time, and that direct us and lead us on in another way, and lead us on to something higher than the primitive world had. And I think there's abundant evidence that that is the case, that the Bible does lead us to a very profound set of truths and beliefs that transcend those periods of time, and therefore lift up and elevate the world and lead it to higher and higher levels of insight and truth from God. And I think there's a number of ways in which we can see that that is the case. First of all, I would like to make the observation in directly confronting these particular texts of Scripture that the author mentions, is that I think these are generalizations based on selective sampling of Scripture. If every verse of Scripture struck us the way that these particular verses of Scripture do, and like I say, most of them are legal type codes, the kind of thing that you might expect opening up the Code of Hammurabi or maybe even a contemporary detailed legal document. They're not very inspiring in the sense of making one think very lofty thoughts when you read them. They're more sort of thoughts about how to deal with cultural, social ills or types of confrontations that you might see brought before a court of law. To take those kinds of texts, which they're very heavily drawn from those kinds of texts in Scripture, to take those texts and generalize that those represent what we find throughout the Bible, I think is incredibly unfair. It is based upon the assumption that the readers of these texts are not actually reading the Bible, because much of the Bible simply doesn't fall in this category at all. Who could read the Psalms of David as an entirety, as a whole, and come away with the conclusion that they're nothing but legal texts like that? Who could read the book of Job or the Proverbs or the prophets of the Old Testament or the Gospels or the letters of Paul and come to the conclusion that they are nothing but those kinds of texts. It's simply not the case. And I think those that take the time to read the Bible and give it a chance will find that most of the Bible does not fit in that category of that kind of literature. Second observation I would make is that these kinds of arguments, the ones that we see here, is based upon the assumption that God will always communicate by what we consider to be the highest standard of literature. And I just think that that is a false assumption or presupposition. God communicates, we believe, in modes or ways of communication that are appropriate to directing people. Sometimes those are eloquent, sometimes they're high literature, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes there'll be lofty poetry, and sometimes there'll be very frank and to the point prose. There are, if God is communicating to people who have a very concrete type of a way of communicating, and they are in need of a legal code, or they're in need of guidance so far as social structure is concerned, and in a certain context, then God will communicate in the way that is appropriate in those circumstances. I just think that it's the assumption that God would communicate in this way rather than that, because we generally find that kind of literature more uplifting, is a poor assumption given the nature of what the Bible is. The third observation that I would make is that all of these arguments that are being made here, not only in this point but in others, criticizing the Scriptures or trying to discredit the Bible, ignores the rather obvious response, which is that the Bible has been enormously significant in inspiring art, inspiring beautiful creations of the human mind. In fact, I think that it can be said without any real contradiction that the most inspiring, most uplifting works of human hands and of human minds throughout history have been inspired by Christian ideals and by biblical ideals. One does not have to travel throughout Europe or throughout the various cathedrals and seeing the works of Michelangelo or any of those things to see this. One can experience it by listening to Handel's Messiah. The music, the uplifting music based upon the biblical narrative that has been generated is absolutely astonishing and uplifting to the human heart. Reading literature of people like Dante in his Divine Comedy, or the Milton's Paradise Lost, these are remarkable, outstanding pieces of literature, not to mention the enormous other impact that the Bible has made on all kinds of literature in Western civilization for millennia. These are I think very powerful indicators that the Bible is a source of inspiration, that history continues to unfold the manifold, uncountable ways in which the Christian revelation and the Christian set of truth claims can generate and inspire art and literature and all these kinds of expressions of the human spirit. So this claim that the Bible is just this boring, oppressive, astonishingly unimpressive collection of writings that fit the model of those sorts of things that, or those texts of Scripture that are mentioned at the very beginning, and that's what all of the Bible is enormously short-sighted and is based upon, the only way the argument will work is if the people who read it are deplorably ignorant of the Bible and unwilling to check out the Bible for themselves. So I challenge you to read not only the Scriptures, but also take a look at the art that's been inspired by it of all different sorts, whether that be musical, whether it be written, whether it be in the form of buildings that have been built to inspire a sense of awe and wonder at the biblical storyline. Just recently, just within the last few weeks, I was up in Missouri, in St. Louis, for a convention there, and I was able to get down to the St. Louis Cathedral, which is an absolutely astonishing and beautiful place. Just to use that as one example, if you look up pictures of it, or if you have the opportunity to go there, it is an incredible work of art, and as you walk into it, at least my sense was in walking into it, that this is an awe-inspiring place. And I looked around it for maybe 45 minutes or so, walking around, looking at the various, works of art in there, the various it really is designed after the model of maybe a Byzantine type structure, and it resembles various basilicas that you might find in Rome. It reminded me some of the artwork of the Church of St. Paul outside the walls, some of the beautiful colors and the various icons throughout the building. just a very impressive and uplifting and powerful place, all of which was built around biblical storylines. And so I think that the claims of this particular argument are just simply false if you would compare them to the Bible and to the influence of the Bible down through the centuries. I think you'll see that it is a very selective and poorly designed argument trying to discredit the Bible, which has been enormously significant. And I think that is proof of, or it is suggestive of, the divine origin of the Scriptures.